Welcome to the APA Child and Family Advocacy chat here on YouTube. I'm John Murray. I'm a research fellow in psychology at Washington College, and I also serve as a researcher at the Harvard Medical School Center on Media and Child Health, Children's Hospital of Boston. This slide shows the history of reports about media violence and children, beginning in the 1940s with concerns about movies, comic books, radio. And then in the late 1940s, television broadcasting began, and Congress began holding hearings in the early 1950s, 1953 to be precise, on the issue of TV violence and its effects on children. This then led to the Surgeon General's study in the late 1960s into the early 70s, and in 1972, the Surgeon General released a report that said violence on television does contribute to aggressive behavior in children who watch those programs. This conclusion was reaffirmed in the 1982 report by the National Institute of Mental Health, which followed up the Surgeon General's report and reaffirmed the conclusions. In the 1990s, the American Psychological Association released a report from its task force on television and social behavior, actually, after impaneling a group of 9 psychologists to study these issues, and again confirmed that viewing violence leads to increases in aggressive behavior in children and youth. My colleagues and I, Norm Pecora and Ellen Wartella, produced a report in 2007 that reviewed 50 years of research on this topic and reaffirmed the harmful effects of media violence. There are 3 primary effects of TV violence viewing, or media violence viewing in general: aggression, desensitization, and fear. The aggression effect suggests that children who watch media violence will become more aggressive, more willing to use violence to solve problems, more likely to get into fights and arguments. The desensitization effect suggests that those who watch a large amount of media violence will become less concerned about the suffering of others, more willing to tolerate ever-increasing levels of violence in the world around them, and therefore are more likely to engage in aggressive behavior. The third and final effect, fear, suggests that children who watch a lot of media violence will become more fearful about the world around them, more likely to greatly overestimate their risk of becoming a victim of violence. It's sometimes referred to as the mean world syndrome. We begin to think the world is as mean and dangerous as it appears on television or in films. So what do we know about the effects of media violence? We've talked about the 3 main effects. We know that in many cases there's a relationship strongly demonstrated between television violence viewing and aggressive behavior. It's a relationship that's complicated, and in the next slide we'll see just how complicated it is. Yes, the relationship is complicated. How do you get from, up at the top of the slide, viewing violence to, down at the bottom of the slide, behaving aggressively in interpersonal conflicts? Well, there's a whole series of internal processes that must go on the left side of this slide: the encoding of aggressive scripts, the rehearsal, and the storing away for increased accessibility of these aggressive scripts. And being aggressive also affects other behaviors: less popular, lower academic achievement, and a greater interest in TV violence. So you can see how difficult that is, but we're going to look in the next slide at largely this left side of the equation: the encoding, the rehearsal, the increased aggression, availability of aggressive scripts, because that's the area that has the least solid research evidence at the moment. And so here on the left are the 3 areas that we want to explore in terms of a window into behavioral process, the intellectual or cognitive behavioral processing of aggressive scripts and aggressive behaviors. We'll see what happens in the next slide if we can somehow observe the brain processes while viewing violent imagery. One of our early studies, published in 2006, looked at the brains of children 8 to 12 years old while they watched violence while resting in a magnetic resonance imaging unit. As you can see in the schematic here, there's a projector that projects a video into the unit so that the children can watch the screen. And since this is an fMRI, a functional MRI, we're looking at continuous activations of various areas of the brain, the whole cortex, during the viewing of violent and nonviolent TV programs. So what were the youngsters watching during this experiment? They were watching 2 3-minute clips of 3 different kinds of video input. Violent clips, which were taken from Rocky IV. If you've ever seen a Rocky movie, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. There's a lot of beating and punching and a touch of blood here and there. And we chose this particularly because we wanted close interpersonal violence. So there are 2 scenes taken from Rocky. There are then also 2 scenes taken from a National Geographic special on animals at play, not engaging in violence or aggression later, but young animals in play, so that it's active but not violent. And then the third set of 2 clips were just a white X on a blue screen to measure the brain activation patterns when they're just eyes open staring at the screen. Well, this is the output that you get from the functional magnetic resonance imaging scanning. This happens to be activation areas in the brain while watching violent video, with all the other activations, that is the watching of animals at play and the watching of just a blank screen with an X on it, taken out. So what you're seeing here is your brain on violence, or in this case, 8-year-old children, 8 to 12-year-old children's brains on violence. And all of the children have been, brains have been summarized into this slide. The activations that you see up on the top row are views, slices through the brain, through the composite brain of 8-year-olds, starting at the top of the brain, top of the head, and then moving to ever lower and lower slices through the skull, through the brain. So on the bottom row, you begin to pick up down deep in the brain structure, an area in the third brain from the left called AMYG, the amygdala, and below that the hippocampus, HIPP. These are important structures that we'll want to talk about, but we can see them activating here. And the next slide will summarize what we were really interested in these structures. So, the structures that we were interested in and that you saw displayed in the previous slide were particularly the areas of the amygdala, which is responsible for initiating fight or flight and sensing danger in the environment. The posterior cingulate, which is associated with trauma memories, and it's the area where PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, memories seem to be stored. We were also interested in the premotor cortex up in the, well, in this case, in the right hemisphere. It's an area that's used for planning behavior, planning motor actions. And then we're predominantly interested in right hemisphere activations because those are negative emotions, positive emotions such as the ah, looking at a young animal playing, the aw, isn't that cute, would be activations in the left hemisphere. So we were interested in these four central areas of the brain. And so when we looked at the overall results, we pretty much acquired the activations in the areas that we expected to see them. The limbic system. What you see in this slide is left and right hemisphere. As I mentioned, we were primarily expecting to see activations in the right hemisphere rather than the left, because that's where negative emotions are processed. And we did end up finding those kinds of patterns of results. The limbic area, that's where the emotional system, which is made up of various organs, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and various others, are involved. The temporal areas, frontal lobe, looking at primarily premotor cortex in the frontal lobe and processing of violent stimuli. And the other lobes, the parietal and occipital, were also heavily loaded to the right hemisphere. So how are children affected by viewing violence? How do they become what I've often called thoughtless vigilantes? That is, they act without thinking. They take retribution, they lash out at others as a result of having watched all these violent images. How does that happen? Well, in the brain mapping study that we just talked about, we were looking at the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational planning. Violent images activate the limbic system, starting with the amygdala. The images of this violence, seen on the screen, are stored in the back of the brain in the posterior cingulate, which is important because that's where long-term memories of frightening or aggressive or threatening actions are stored. And they're stored in a way that makes them easy to access. Hence, for example, the parallel with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, when these memories of terrible things that they've witnessed, they've seen, come flashing back without a moment's notice. So, when confronted with threats, the violence viewers respond with aggression because they fall back on these instantly activated scripts, and the aggression is then guided by the scripts stored in the posterior cingulate. Other studies have, by Matthews and his colleagues and what have you, have also suggested reduced prefrontal cortex involvement, and that's interesting because it means there aren't any brakes put on the violence. There's not the inherent, let's stop and think about this for a moment before we act out and lash out. Is this really dangerous? Am I overreacting? So the reduced prefrontal cortex, the system for careful consideration, is not involved as heavily. Hence, heavy violence viewers, video gamers, and particularly male adolescents, are more likely to react to any provocation with this thoughtless violence of thoughtless vigilantes. So, now that you're armed with all of the information as background to the research and public opinion and policy concerns, what can you do to advocate for change? Well, there are various things you can do that require differing levels of involvement. One, quite simply, you could join a national or regional organization concerned with your issues that you wish to discuss and advocate for. Two, you can check policy statements from professional organizations that have reviewed the research and are taking a public position on the issue, in this case media violence, and certainly that can include psychologists and educators and pediatricians and general medical practice, as well as issues raised by legislators and parents and others. So look for professional policy statements to incorporate into your advocacy. Then you're prepared to, number 3, write an opinion article for a newspaper or for a professional newsletter or other avenues of dissemination. These are sometimes called op-ed pieces or opinion pieces on the editorial pages of newspapers, either local ones or national ones. Then, other things that you can do is give presentations to local groups concerning the issues. That way you begin to communicate to your colleagues and local supporters about advocating for these issues. You can write a policy brief for government agencies or regulatory bodies who are holding hearings to discuss these issues. You can testify before government panels, such as congressional or national panels who are holding hearings on the topic. The main point is to simply get involved at whatever level you feel comfortable involving yourself. And all of these can be handled as part of your daily activities. Thank you for joining us to discuss the impact of media violence on children and the ways in which you can advocate for better programs and better policies for children. You can learn more in the recent book by the Divisionn37 Advocacy Forum. It's called Child and Family Advocacy, Bridging the Gaps Between Research and Policy. Please join us again for other episodes of this series of turning research into advocacy.